You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back for a possibly very controversial episode where we invite our listeners to keep close attention to which of my co-hosts, including myself, may have mask-off moments and reveal ourselves to be horrid authoritarians eager to squish down free expression, be it in the form of violence, bad words, naughty visuals, or subversive ideas. I'm Chris, and in this episode, we'll be talking about censorship in all its shapes and forms, and pose the question of whether or not restricting freedom of expression and what creatives are allowed to explore, what audiences are allowed to see, can ever be warranted, and more extremely, if it can actually be a good thing, be that for the sake of our world, or their souls, or indeed even creative freedom, as surely many will argue, though perhaps contested in this episode, that cinema, for instance, thrived in America under the Hays Code, or in Russia and old communist bloc in the time of the Soviet Union's control. And even today, many will say that one of the best cinematic countries is Iran, a country that actively jails its greatest directors. Could it be that working under the thumb of an adversarial force makes writers and directors emboldened to find creative ideas and solutions? Perhaps something to fight, someone to trick? Yes, could it actually be healthy? Oh, and what of the old puritanical thought that some content, be it visuals or words, should never be shown in case it might endanger public morality? And on that note, how do we feel about gratuitous scenes hitting the cutting room floor? How do we feel about scenes being edited years after the film's original release? And if we indeed come out at the end of this as die-hard free speech advocates, what of hate speech and calls for violence? Are they too exempt? Could it be that the dreaded mask-off moment is that we are perfectly happy to sit back and allow the worst of humanity to put their ideas out there, and that we will even defend their rights to do so? So yeah, this episode could definitely be controversial, and it's time to turn up the heat and just bring in my three absolutely wonderful co-hosts, Tom, Sol, and for the very first time, Niels. And since this is your first episode, Niels, it might be fun to just bring you on first. And maybe to start with the basics. I mean, what's the first thing you think about when you hear the word censorship?
Hi, everyone. I am Niels. I am Onderhond on the forum. And when I think about censorship, I think about the current situation in Hong Kong and China. You know, China is now pushing more control on Hong Kong cinema. And where Hong Kong used to be a thriving place for crime cinema, they now actually have rules that say that the bad guys can't win anymore. A big problem there in Hong Kong where their films, they don't have the typical triad stuff anymore. But instead, you see more and more films where the police is winning. So that's the first thing I think about when censorship is mentioned right now.
Yeah, definitely. We'll dive into Chinese censorship a bit later because that's a bit of a hot topic, recent issue with a lot of flimsy rules as well. Like you can't do anything that might offend the sensibilities of communism or socialism in China as well. There's just a lot of these vague things that are entirely up to the interpretation of the censors. So let's see what kind of effect that has. What about you, Tom? What's the first thing you think about when you hear the word censorship?
The first thing that comes to my mind is horror, the 80s, video nasties, all these films in the UK that were banned for being deemed too violent and disturbing. Fear that young children would get their hands on them. And censorship is something that runs quite closely with horror films due to the scenes of violence and gore, etc. So it's something that comes up quite a lot when you see horror films that are cut for various reasons, and it's a topic that's quite close to my heart for those reasons.
And what about you, Saul?
When I think of censorship, I don't think so much in terms of rules imposed on filmmakers, like what Niels was mentioning with Hong Kong. I think more in line with what Tom mentioned about films being banned, but not only that, I think about films that are banned and also films that are being edited and being cut down, and certain images might be taken out, or certain images might get blurred out. So films where they might have blurred out some nudity, or there's this push to totally censor Gone with the Wind and stuff like that. That for me is what censorship is, taking an existing film and cutting it down or banning it, rather than rewriting a film that's in production to meet certain standards. So that for me is very different to my concept of censorship, which is cutting down something or banning something outright.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, essentially, my first thoughts tend to go to very restrictive regimes that just has such an impact on films, where then the filmmakers just know that they cannot do certain things, which makes it very interesting to watch and see if they can find some ways to trick the censors. That's always a really interesting thing to spot. And my mind very often goes to the old Soviet bloc in particular, where, you know, you have films like Saul mentioned completely banned or butchered, often coming out years later. I mean, this happens to so many films, from Andrei Shishlovsky, which has one of Tom's favorite films on what's it called again?
On the Silver Globe.
Yes, you know, this got so butchered by censors to the point that it eventually just abandoned. It couldn't be finished anymore, and, you know, it was just compiled years later. And the same happened to films by Jerzy Skolimowski, who's come back into conversation again with his latest EO. But I mean, he had films that were only really released and kind of like reassembled years later. So just so those are kind of like the stories and things I think about the first thing when I hear about censorship. Also Iran, and now more recently, like Niels mentioned, China, because that's obviously going to have such a big impact on one of the world's biggest film countries. So it will be really fascinating to see that explored. So now we all talked about kind of like what's the first thing we associate with censorship. What's kind of our knee-jerk reaction when we hear about censorship? Is it anger? Is it worry? Is it displeasure? Or some kind of interest?
I think, like most people, I think artists should have creative expression and they should be able to make what they want. At the same time, I think it's a restriction that can help an artist to overcome some ideas or some laziness, maybe. Where you just, instead of expressing something that he wants to say, he can say, and he has to find new ideas and new ways to express those. While I never support censorship, I think there is a part of it that is good and that will make better films in the end. So it's a bit conflicting, I think. You don't want it. On the other hand, there's going to be directors that thrive under censorship rules and that kind of need those limitations to help them creatively.
My initial reaction is one of frustration. The fact that someone else is potentially blocking a filmmaker from expressing their thoughts how they want them, or even cutting parts of the film and denying us, you know, the chance to see the film as intended. But then because of that, it then leads to interest, because anything that is being censored or banned or blocked for various reasons, I want to watch it and I want to find out why it's not deemed fit for my eyes. It's always intrigued me from a very young age, this concept of banned films. So, you know, the people who make the decisions to censor and block these things, supposedly for the good of the general public, it's having the adverse effect in that it's making me more interested in a film that I might never have been interested in the first place had it not been censored.
My reaction to censorship is, I guess, more similar to Tom than Niels, because, again, I'm coming from the point of view that censorship is something which is done after a film has been made, rather than something that affects the film before it's been made, because censorship gets imposed on it afterwards. And I guess similarly, I find it disappointing. And I agree with Tom that in most cases it's ineffective because it brings more attention to the fact that there is something there which the censors, for whatever reason, don't want you to see. And I did mention with Chris, we were talking about where we're going to take this episode, that I might have to bring in the concept of age restrictions, because I guess for me, I think that's a bit more effective than outright censorship. I mean, I'm not a big fan of these gigantic age restrictions where you've got like 15 plus, 18 plus. There just needs to be a general like cutoff point. You don't want 5-year-olds to be watching hardcore sex scenes. Well, when you get to the stage where, most kids are 9 or 10 years old, they pretty much know what's out there already. I think if you set like a sort of like cutoff point there, you've got like, well, some of these films aren't suitable for all ages. Some of the films are suitable for all ages. I think it's probably the better way to do it rather than bring attention to anything. They could have come with a warning if you want to, but yeah, I don't think censorship really does anything at all. And I don't think cutting films down really does any respect to the filmmakers themselves and the vision that they wanted to get across if you're forcing them to redact different parts of what they've made. Especially if you think about films like Gone with the Wind, where the filmmakers are no longer alive, I do think it is kind of disrespectful.
My first reaction to hearing about censorship is, like Tom, frustration. I mean, I think that Hays Code is an interesting place to focus on because there you have two very clear movements, if you will, or periods. You have the period of the High Hays Code, and then you have the New Hollywood period. And then essentially just as soon as the Hays Code ended, a different set of essentially cinematic freedom kicked in. If you compare those two, you have the advocates of the Hays Code, which is often called the golden era of cinema or golden era of Hollywood, where they will say, they managed to create all of these wonderful pieces of cinema without needing to resort to extreme violence or gratuitous sex, etc. And you will have people talking about writers like Preston Sturges, who managed to make innocent words sound dirty, who managed to allude to so much. There's a lot of people talking about people who trick the censors by letting bad guys get away. All kinds of things like that. And then you also have cases of films that were banned or films that were cut. But then, while I think there are a lot of wonderful cinema made in that period, the freedom that kicked in after the Hays Code ended, started with New Hollywood, I think that's significantly more interesting. And of course, there's the question of cause and effect too. Would that period have been as interesting if they always had that freedom? Maybe they wouldn't have gotten that boom of exciting films. From adversary, there is a lot of emboldened creativity. Cinema in authoritarian states often is very interesting. You see that over and over again. You see it in Iran, you see it in China, in the old Eastern Bloc. When you have an adversary, I do actually think that certain directors can really be, like Neil said, inspired by this and do some absolutely amazing work. But I do think that if those restrictions weren't there, we'd still get really interesting and exciting cinema. So I suppose I'm somewhat conflicted. I would never want to impose film censorship, but I do think that a lot of really great cinema is born out of it. It's much the same way. I wouldn't want to impose, say, artists to be tortured or artists to have terrible things happen in their life. But from that often comes great art as well. Well, I never wish for anything bad to happen to people. Once it happens, there can be some beautiful things that come out of it. And there's a lot of things to dive into and explore from that can create really wonderful artistic experiences. So on that topic then, would any of you ever actually support film censorship? Or are any of you actually in favor of some kind of film censorship now?
For me personally, I don't think I would ever support film censorship in any way or impose it if I were in the situation to do so. I also can think of any censorship or rules now that are good, even the silly ones, like in Japan, for example, where you can't show genitalia. It's silly stuff, I think. It doesn't help. What Sol also mentioned, for example, by imposing censorship, you just draw more attention to it. I think it's called the Barbara Streisand effect because of something she did in the 80s that she wanted to get rid of or to be banned. And then by putting attention to that, people learned about it, in fact, rather than if she hadn't mentioned anything, they wouldn't have known. Yeah, for me, I don't think it has any purpose, it has any benefits, and it will just turn against those who impose it on people.
Like Niels, I don't support any form of censorship. And I think you make some interesting points as well, Chris, when discussing the Hays Code, about the fact that it may have led to greater creativity in certain areas of cinema, because that's not something I've ever really considered, because I suppose I focus on the negative aspects of it. You know, again, looking at it through a horror lens, I think of films like Freaks, Todd Browning's Freaks. There's a lot of footage cut from that, and we've got a version today that works. It works incredibly well, but there are a lot of scenes that are missing, and that was largely due to them being deemed too violent or graphic, or displaying imagery that wasn't deemed fit for public consumption at the time. And it's a real shame looking back on things like that, that there's all that footage lost. And it just makes you think about other films that have potentially been butchered or even prevented from seeing the light of day at all because they weren't deemed fit for the time that they were created. But viewed now, they may not be considered offensive compared to how far cinema has progressed in the time that's passed. So there's a lot to think about there. And also, one aspect of censorship that I do actually think is important and should be there is relating to animal cruelty. It's sad that something like that has to be in place, but again, it's not something that should be encouraged or allowed within cinema.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So you actually do support some form of censorship. Would you say that scenes involving animal cruelty in existing films should be cut or altered, or is this more of a production standard? Because I think that those are two different things too. It's like saying, oh, no, you cannot actually kill people or endanger people's lives on the film set, for instance. I wouldn't necessarily call that censorship.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, from a production standard, I don't think it should be something that is allowed. I'm not saying that it should be censored and banned from films, pre-existing films that display such cruelty. Whilst I don't find it pleasant to watch, it's been there and it's potentially part of the film, but I just think that it should be prevented from occurring, moving forward in this day and age, really.
I don't really support censorship myself. Like I mentioned earlier on, what I would prefer, what I think is the better option, is to have rating restrictions for age groups. If you think some viewers would be too young and impressionable to hear hate speech or other offensive material, maybe slap a warning on it, maybe put an age restriction so it's harder to see it in the cinema. But, all films are available on the internet now anyway, so you can't really control what's out there. So I don't think censorship really does any good in that point of view. Probably the trickiest part of censorship these days would be hate speech. And I know with recent documentary, What is a Woman? There were a lot of moves with that one to not get it distributed. And on Letterboxd, they actually removed all reviews because they were getting too many moderation complaints. So for films that are relatively mainstream like that are transphobic, or I guess if you've got homophobic content or racially slurring content these days, I guess it's a bit of a trickier ground to tread. But I guess I'm still sort of in favor of freedom of expression, because even though I haven't watched the transphobic doc, most of the comments that I've read about it are people who are saying things where you pretty much expect it. And I think most people will be watching something like that, will be watching with a grain of salt already. So you sort of have to give people a bit of credibility. I mean, no, if they're a 5-year-old child who's sitting down to watch it because they're browsed through the internet, no, they shouldn't be watching it. But if you've got a mature teenager or young adult or adult out there sitting and watching something, we have to give people a little bit of credit. I think the power of movies is sometimes a bit overrated. I don't know how much impact movies actually do have on the behavior of people and the thinking of people. We probably all agree that we've got the power to make up our own mind, and we could sit through the transphobic documentary. Actually, Niels has actually seen it and logged on Letterboxd already, so we can see it and watch it and go, well, that's crap. So if we can do that, surely most other people out there can also watch something that's either got hate speech or offensive amounts of nudity or coarse language or whatever, or extreme violence, and sort of watch it and take everything with a grain of salt. If we can do it, surely we should be able to expect that most other people can do it also.
I would like to mention something about that documentary because I have indeed, like Saul said, I have seen it. I don't think it should have been censored. The documentary is made because those ideas are out there. There are people who believe them. So it's not just about the people who are not sure or are uncertain about a subject, but it also kind of shows what lives in society. You can watch a documentary like that and it's obvious propaganda. There's a narrative there. The footage is based on that narrative and is cut in such a way that it supports the narrative. At the same time, we also have other documentaries that have different propaganda that are just as manipulative. So once you start censoring those, I think it becomes very hard to draw a hard line there. But if you watch that, it's clear what the documentary wants to say and where it steers people and how it manipulates people into believing a certain message. But I think it's up to the people. And I think it's important that get a grasp of what lives in society. And documentaries like that, I think, are a good way to get that, even when the message itself can be manipulative. I would also like to say, because I said I don't support any kind of censorship, what Tom said, of course, about animal cruelty, I don't support animal cruelty, but I think it should be an illegal activity. So it shouldn't just be happening anyway. It shouldn't be part of censorship. It should just be common sense to not do that on film.
Yeah, I think the difference between illegal acts and censorship, it's like you can fake animal cruelty just as you can fake a murder or you can fake time travel. I mean, I think that censorship is about like what ideas you can talk about and explore, not how you present those ideas, because obviously there are acts you can do on a film set that are criminal. I mean, the directors of Cannibal Holocaust were, for instance, arrested because the effects were so realistic that they thought they had killed people who were part of the film. So, like that would have been a crime. So I don't think that was a question of censorship. I just think that's a question of other existing laws out there and how those can be applied. And yeah, in terms of propaganda films and films that have, very nasty nature, films that propagate ideas that are close to hate speech. I mean, like, what do we even be talking about when talking about censoring them? I mean, all Nazi propaganda films are still out there. I mean, Jude Sud is still out there. Renny Riefenstahl are still out there. And you have like this whole history of propaganda films from the Soviet Union, from a long string of different authoritarian regimes. You have films made by specific religions. What would the course of censorship be there? Especially when you have platforms like YouTube filled with every single different kind of hate speech. I guess on the topic of hate speech, or more extremely, direct calls for violence, I can see why some things that could be done in a film could theoretically be illegal, and that would be a discussion with, is that censorship or is that not censorship? I mean, because in certain countries, for instance, specific hate speech is illegal. In certain countries, for some reason, not in the US unless there's a direct result, but in many countries, direct call for violence. Like if you make a movie and you say, "Hi, go kill that person," like, or these people deserve to die, you might face some kind of prosecution. Or indeed, if a movie slanders someone, like claims these are real events and creates a film about someone, you can sue, because that's not, I don't think those things are necessarily the same as direct censorship if there are existing laws that are there for a good reason, but it's a hazy area. Like I see Niels writing in the chat there that don't incite violence is a pre-existing law in the Netherlands. I think that's the case in Norway, but like in the US, it's not really. Like you can go up on the stage and call for someone's death, and unless you directly tell someone to go kill them and they go do it, you're not accountable. I mean, there's been trials like that where you have members of specific groups going up, say, kill this person. Someone went a little bit later and killed them, and they still got off because they didn't see a direct connection. It's very difficult to assess. Even one of Godard's films, which he did during his more revolutionary Zika Vertov years, In From the East, I mean, that film ends with a direct call for violent revolution. we kind of show people how to do certain things. Like, should that be illegal? It's a very long, complicated discussion. Well, what do you guys think about that? Because I find that a bit complicated too. Like, is there any realm of stopping certain acts in films as shown that you would say is not censorship if it's covered by existing laws?
It is censorship if you are cutting or banning a film full stop. So I'd say even if it's illegal and there are things that you shouldn't be doing, like if there was a film which was entirely full on animal violence with no reenactments, and that was illegal in the country in which it was made, it would still be censorship to ban it or to edit it down. There would still be censorship. Although, yeah, I don't know, it's a bit of a tricky one. It is still technically censorship, but it's more so censorship with a justification behind it, as opposed to censorship because, we don't think that people who watch this will be educated enough to realize that this is just a propaganda film. Yes, it's coming from a different perspective in that case. It is still technically censorship, but you're censoring something because it breaks the law rather than because you're afraid of what people who watch it will think, which is what a lot of people who are calling for censorship these days are doing. People who want to edit smoking out of older movies, people who want to bleep out the N-word in older films, people who want to blur out images of child nudity in films before that became a bit of a big no-no. All of those, for me, are ones where people are doing the censorship because they're afraid of what people will think when they look at it. Whereas if you're censoring it because they've broken a law, well, that is still censorship. Are you doing it because of the legalities, not because you're afraid of people who are watching it might go, oh, that's great, I'm going to start using the N-word. That's how censorship seems to go these days. People are like, oh, we can't have this transphobic documentary out there because everybody who watches is going to take it as the gospel and believes everything that they say. Whereas, I don't know, I just think a lot of people will be watching things like that. We're watching with a grain of salt.
Well, I think we hit a bit of a conundrum there too, because obviously in many countries, a lot of the censorship is directly tied to laws. For instance, in the Soviet bloc, and I think still in China, it's illegal to insult the government, or it's illegal to criticize the political project they're doing. Certain acts of subversion is illegal. It's all, to an extent, relative to ruling peoples. We can talk about animal cruelty and say that, oh, there's a good reason behind that, but that's how people might think about drugs or smoking, or especially child nudity. I mean, people can say child nudity is child porn. Child porn is illegal. There should never be any child nudity in any media. That's completely illegal. Like if there was a country that had laws against sharing child nudity, and there was no restriction on films specifically, but the film broke that rule, that would fall into the same kind of category. There's a lot of, for instance, conservative Islamic countries where insulting Islam is illegal. We had similar things in other countries with other religions. So I think that all of us could have different morals depending on what religion we are, depending on how we see animal rights, depending on how we see children, depending on how we feel about smoking. So it gets difficult. And someone can sit here and say smoking should never be allowed, smoking should be illegal, or depiction of smoking should be illegal because it's cancerous, and a long list of other reasons. I have never actually heard of the people who want to edit out smoking. Honestly, I might be very ignorant on that point. I would love to hear more about that actually. So, but yeah, I'm sure they have reasons. It's just a question of how good the reasons are. Do you have any cases of people wanting to edit out smoking just at hand?
I don't have any offhand. It was probably in a comedy movie, but I did see, I think it was in a comedy movie, that these people were actually going to replace smoking with lollipops and edit it out. Sort of how like the actors like sucking lollipops instead. I have no idea how that would explain the amount of smoke going on in the background, but I do recall seeing that in a film. I can't remember the title.
Was it Thank You for Smoking? I don't remember exactly. Was it?
Possibly. I show excerpts from films with what I teach, and sometimes I'll be showing a film from the 1950s, and you got somebody smoking, and the kids are going, no, you can't show that. And I'm like, well, this film was made 75 years ago, before information about tobacco really came out. So at that time, it actually was the norm. And yet they've been told by their parents they're not meant to be watching anybody smoking. So I guess it's not really censorship per se, because the parents aren't the law. They can't ban the films from being shown, but they're obviously making those sort of choices. Smoking is definitely one of the biggest things, where I guess animal violence would be the other one, be one of the biggest things where people will be looking at things differently these days to in the past. And I guess also slavery and treatment of African Americans in cinema, racist stereotypes, blackface. I guess that's viewed very differently these days to 80 or 90 years ago. So there's a whole lot of different things like that where just values have changed over time. But that shouldn't mean that we should be going in and altering the past. I don't think that really helps anyone out.
I definitely agree with Sol that we shouldn't be revisiting films and editing them so that they are a reflection of today's standard, because they provide an important historical interest for educational purposes, where people can see the progress that society has made as a whole. And I also think that Chris raises some very good points about how much of a grey area censorship can be, because everyone has individual thresholds of what is deemed offensive to themselves, and having an authority or a film board in place to make those decisions can be important for some people who are perhaps more impressionable, but for people who have got a greater understanding of the world and are open to hearing from both sides of a political stance without being swayed as such, it's important to get a grasp and understand the different views that are out there. So it is a very grey area. For me, I would rather just see things as directors did.
I never really had a big issue with, say, TV stations editing out nudity. I never thought that was kind of an offense. I just thought it was silly. I would say that if certain releases are intended for children, or if you show a film on a mainstream channel and it has some things that channel doesn't want to show during a specific time slot, for instance, like it used to be the case, I don't have a moral issue with that station saying, okay, we're going to cut this nudity out, or we're going to cut this violent scene out, as long as I can go and buy that film on physical media or watch that film on Netflix. I think the only time I would ever actually start to have an issue is if only one version becomes available. I remember there was a case recently which blew up. It was the French Connection. I think both the Criterion channel and other channels were showing a version of the film which essentially removed Popeye's racism. So for those who don't know, Popeye, played by Gene Hackman in the film, is a pretty iconic character. He's a really slimy New York police officer who is very shady, very racist. He's a complete asshole. And there's a relatively famous scene in that film where he uses the N-word. And on the Criterion channel and other channels, that scene were just edited out. And that caused a lot of fervor because for many different reasons, including a lot of people who thought that it made him far more sympathetic. I remember one story of someone telling the story of how they saw it on release in a black neighborhood, and everyone shared because it showed the New York police being racist. And so there's many different moral ways to see this, but I think that if it was the case, because suddenly it became very, very hard to see the original version, we had to have it on physical copy, essentially, because some of the streaming versions available were showing the original version. I think that's when it becomes a bit of a moral issue, if we suddenly start to rewrite history completely and the original film is just no longer available. I guess you could say the same thing about George Lucas editing down Star Wars as well, the original versions not being available, but at least that's not imposed by other people.
So one thing I would like to add about the morality and how it affects censorship. People here are Westerners, so we kind of share the same morality. So when it's about animal cruelty, we all agree that it shouldn't happen. But I think one of the interesting points that Saul mentioned was blackface. I think blackface is commonly accepted as something that is not done. Only in our local culture, we have Black Pete, who's coming up, and every year it's a big situation here because he's in fact a blackface. He's like a help of Saint Nicholas, and he comes to give presents to the children. So they're trying to kind of soft banning it or trying to change him. That's a big situation here, just as an example of how local culture can affect something like censorship and can have very different standards and very different implications on how censorship is put on.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Niels, in terms of how a lot of morality is local, and we could be sitting here with people from a different culture who would have no issue whatsoever with animal cruelty on screen, for instance, and just be stunned that they would even bring it up. So they might see that as absolutely horrendous and ridiculous censorship, for instance, and this is why a lot of the talk about like what could we consider valid censorship, and I don't think any of us have really proved any censorship so far, how that discussion can go, just how localized it might be.
It's interesting, Chris, that you mention almost a kind of self-censorship there with George Lucas and Star Wars, because that makes me think of A Clockwork Orange and when Stanley Kubrick decided to pull the film from British cinemas because of fears of copycat violence. And that's, in a way, a kind of censorship brought on by the director from their own fears of what they've created. And whilst it was withdrawn from British cinemas, it also did a lot to enhance the film's notoriety. And it was something that was in my mind growing up as a youngster, years after the film was released, as a film that I really wanted to seek out because it had been banned and censored to an extent. And that is one of the key things that got me interested in controversial cinema as such, and seeking out films that have been censored or banned for any reason. So that's just an example of how it can have the opposite effect that people want when they do consider censorship.
On this topic, I actually do have a somewhat obscure but interesting case which I saw just last week. Henry de Caen's Stranger in the House, which stars Raimou, is a French film made during the Nazi occupation of France, written by Georges Simenon and actually Henry Georges Clouzot as well. And when I watched it, it was a fairly standard court case film with some slight comedic elements. But I realized after the fact I was actually watching an edited re-release that was done after World War II, because the film was banned originally after Nazi occupation for being anti-Semitic. And the reason for that is that there was subversive propaganda where the villain in the film had a purposefully made Jewish name. So it was nothing overtly anti-Semitic, but essentially the villain, the person who's behind all of it, the person who ends up being guilty, and the way he's portrayed, that's meant to be the shifty Jew. Like that was the whole purpose of it being released under Nazi occupation. And then after World War II, they went back in and changed the villain's name in the editing, and they had actors redubbed only that specific part. And that's an interesting case too, because I don't think Clouzot especially were anti-Semitic or were racist or want to do this. This was just something that was essentially added in because it was under the Nazi occupation. So this is an interesting case too, where is that censorship? Is that changing the past? Or is this more similar, for instance, to how directors after a period of authoritarian censorship and control take back their works and present them the way they originally wanted to? Like a lot of people did in the Eastern Bloc, for instance, where they suddenly added back the original endings or changed some things that were forced on them by the censors. I know you guys probably haven't seen that film, but like, what do you think about cases like that?
I think I agree with Tom there that a director has an ultimate say in how his work is presented, what he shows and when he shows it and how he shows it. If his film is censored at the time of release, or if he could not express himself fully because of censorship, I think it's fair enough to, at a later time, take back his film and reshape it to how he wants it to be. So I think that's fair game for a director.
I'm of the camp that pretty much all censorship is not good, because what we should have instead is restrictions and warnings. So I'd be more than happy with a director taking back and recreating a work to reflect what it was originally like. Assuming that he's using original footage. If he had to reshoot footage and put it in there, I'd say it actually makes it a slightly different film. But if all he's doing is restoring a film to what it was like before it's censored, that can really only be a good thing, because we need generally less censorship. We just need more restrictions and warnings. I think that's been my stance for most of this podcast.
Yeah, I don't see any harm in a director making changes to the work at a later date to reflect changing attitudes. A director's only going to be around for so long anyway. Gets to a point where the work is just as is kind of thing, and just reflects the views of the time. So I don't feel it's problematic for a director to revisit and make any changes. That brings me to an amusing story about a director who didn't make any changes when he was asked to. I don't know if you clicked onto what I'm going to mention yet, but it was, of course, the shower scene in Psycho, where Alfred Hitchcock was told that the scene was too violent, too graphic, and he was advised that it needed to be re-edited and cut before it would be deemed okay to present to general audiences. And he didn't do any any cuts. He just sent it back exactly as it was. And the second time, the board who were reviewing it were fine with it. And I love that story. I think it's brilliant.
And that kind of touches on how arbitrary censorship can be sometimes too, and how one censor to another can have completely different ideas. Or maybe it's even the same censor thinking it was cut down. They kind of got their little power trip, and then it was all fine.
That could be it. You could be right there, Chris. And I love it. It's just Hitchcock giving a middle finger to censorship there, isn't it? And I love it. It's a great story.
It reminds me a little bit of, well, he didn't just send it back, he sent the samurai sword with it. So Miyazaki sent Spirited Away to be released in the US to Harvey Weinstein, was handling the project. He sent the samurai sword with it, told him not to cut anything out of the film or to change anything. So maybe a little correction there. It was Princess Mononoke and not Spirited Away.
I think that we've covered most of the ways of censorship now, but we could also look at self-censorship, indirect censorship, soft censorship that's not necessarily in the face of laws or regulations or even a government entity stamping down and saying you can't show this, but indirect ways that force filmmakers to make certain decisions or make certain cuts, be that, as you mentioned, age ratings, where if you don't make this cut, your film won't be shown in a lot of theaters, or funding, because I know there's a lot of, for instance, state funding that has a long list, like a long criteria of if you don't have every single thing on this checklist, or if you have something on this other checklist, you're not going to get any funding. That's obviously a very different conversation, but how do you guys feel about soft censorship?
Soft censorship is maybe kind of even worse, because most censorship is direct when it's coming from laws and strict rules, but some soft censorship is more like under the covers, what you don't want people to see or what you don't want to be shown. I remember one case in Belgium where Koen Mortier's ex-drummer was being made. It's based on a rather controversial book. So in fact, they sent in 7 scripts to the VAF. It's a film fund in Belgium, which gives filmmakers grants, which you really need to make their films, because funding a film here is very difficult. And so the script was sent back 7 times, each time with a quote like, "This is unacceptable, we cannot show this." If you look up the trailer for Ex-Drummer, you can see how they quoted each time they got the script back with the quotes from the VAF. Eventually, they got the film made, of course, but I think that kind of censorship is really below the belt, because it's not direct, it's not honest. It makes it really tricky for a filmmaker to express himself without even being able to say, look, this film is like this, because there are these and these rules that I had to comply with. it's even harder for the audience to see where the censorship is there.
What's kind of interesting is that I think I have the opposite take to Neil's on soft censorship. I would say that it actually technically isn't really censorship anyway, because censorship for me means taking an existing film and either cutting it or banning it entirely. Whereas if you're imposing rules on how a film is made, for me, that's just about the production of it. It's about the rules and following the rules to get it made. For me, it's just a different kettle of fish. I don't see it as quite as a negative thing. All you're doing is forcing filmmakers to make the movie a little bit differently. Okay, that's fine. It's not like you're taking this final product, which they're happy with, and then chopping out at your own discretion or blurring out parts at your own discretion or banning it entirely. For me, that's much more offensive rather than saying, well, you can't do this and that. I think it's much more offensive to take a final product that somebody's finished with and either tamper with it or ban it outright.
I think it's a really tricky one to digest because I kind of agree with what both Niels are saying and what Sol is saying to an extent, because you both make valid points. But I mean, I suppose it comes down to it that I don't really like any kind of censorship. So I suppose it is a bad thing, soft censorship, in the fact that, you know, directors are forced to take a certain approach, whereas they may prefer another approach to get their message across. So it is kind of, you know, blocking what can be said, how they can say it. So even if the film hasn't yet been created, it is still censoring what their limitations are with the film. So it isn't a good thing.
This ties in with the film culture of each country and also just the rights of expression. Why does someone have the right to get their film made if they can't secure funding? Do filmmakers have a right to get government funds to say or express whatever they want? And do they have the right to get, private backing to say whatever they want? I mean, funding is difficult, but I do think that it is, like Neil said, it's very manipulative. I mean, if you have countries where essentially all film production is dependent on state funding, a lot of countries are quite like that. Or unless you're doing something very, very, very commercial, you will not be able to get the funding to make the film you want unless you get a degree of state subsidies. Sometimes state subsidies from multiple different countries and associated organizations. Like, you're not going to be able to do that. That's why, a lot of the European films you see have just this endless title sequences where you see all of these various government funds that were part of producing the film. And if some of them or many of them have the same kind of list of notes, then it's very easy for a government, or EU, for instance, might start to get the same kind of guidelines as well. But it's starts to get very easy to kind of control what gets expressed and what doesn't. If you have a specific country, for instance, where this can happen more clearly, where you might want to not have anything negative said about, be it the state, be it religion, be it anything else that the powers that be don't like, and filmmakers cannot actually get a film made, cannot get funding because the market is so relatively small that the only way to get funding is from, at least partially from the state, then effectively they ban cinematic speech that they don't like. And so mentioned that, censorship to him is taking a finished product, but in many of these cases you have the finished script, like you have the filmmaker's vision, and they say, oh, we want to make this film with you, but you have to cut X, Y, Z. And that can be a very long process where they keep cutting. Now, is that any different from a studio saying the same thing? Oh, we will fund this, but you have to add, this nude scene, or you have to add X, Y, Z. Is it different? Not necessarily. It still compromises the artist's vision, but if the only real way to get a film made in a country is through state subsidies, that it can get a bit nefarious, or at least a little bit problematic. I guess we're nearing the end of the episode here, but I would be interested in hearing what you guys think the future of censorship is, because at least for me, I thought the days of censorship were slowly fading away. Obviously, you have countries that still have high extents of official censorship, such as Iran, that's been very pronounced. But I thought that we were in a process where countries were slowly removing censorship across the board, and we would, see Iran softening eventually, or only specific countries would remain. But now we are seeing a change in the trend, where obviously one of the biggest cinematic countries in the world, China, just recently started installing extreme censorship measures in terms of what can and cannot be made, released. They're re-editing Hollywood films as well to fit their code. Do you guys think it's possible that we could backslide and there might be much more censorship in the future of cinema?
I think censorship will act more like a wave. It will come and then it will go again at a later time, depending on what the morality is in some parts of the world. And I think in China now, they want to control, and definitely Hong Kong, which is a lot freer. So they want to impose their rules. And then one of those rules is to add censorship to the films and what's being made there. Even in the West now, right-wing governments come up. We might have a resurgence of censorship maybe. And then in other parts of the countries where freedom is loosened, then you'll see a drop in censorship. But I don't think it will go away.
I agree with Niels that censorship will always exist. Primarily, I think for one reason is age restriction on films. There's always going to be a need for people to review films and deem whether they're suitable for people of a certain age, and that can come part and parcel with the reviewing of films to consider censorship in other areas other than just being relevant for children, etc. But I would like to see a future where there's more choice given to the reviewer, and censorship is kind of like an optional thing where the studios will say, this film contains this. Are you willing to see it? And people can make the choice on an individual level. I always get frustrated when I'm watching films on streaming services and there's the little notes that say, this contains violence, suicide, whatever. And I get that certain topics can be sensitive for certain people and there's a use for them. But I think all films should be presented unfiltered as the director intended. And there should be an option for anyone who is dubious about certain aspects of the film may include. They can go and check that out under their own steam and make a choice whether they want to watch the film or not.
I agree that choice is probably the thing that I'd like to see heading forward, that people have the option of watching the censored or uncensored version of something, or if they're watching it with their young family, parents can then decide we want to watch the censored version rather than the uncensored version. I think the way society is heading at the moment, though, we're going to see more and more censorship in the future, or more cause for censorship. So there's a lot of things, because the film industry, we're going to head with 2023. So in 4 years' time, it would be 100 years of talking motion pictures. And values have just changed so much over time. Everything we've discussed, from smoking to child nudity, to animal violence, to use of the N-word, to racial stereotypes. Just so much of society's attitudes have changed over time, and there are just a lot of people who then make these calls that older films that were made at different times should then not be shown, or you have people who log them with a half-star review on Letterboxd and say, well, it was good until blackface showed up in the film. So I just think there's going to be a lot more cause going to the future of the way society is heading, and internet culture and people sharing opinions online. And it's much easier to share opinions, I think, these days to a wider audience than it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago when I was first growing up, with how much the internet's taken off and social media. And I think as these things will just keep going around, we'll find more things in future might end up being caused to get censored out. If veganism does end up taking over, then maybe there'll be cause to edit out scenes where people are sitting around and eating meat. So not just animal cruelty, but also digestion of meat. Some people would probably be in favor of that, but it's just tampering with the past, and I don't like to see that happen. It's good if there's a choice there of the option, maybe have that warning. I mean, I don't like the warnings that Tom talked about. I understand the need for it, especially with things like suicide, because it can trigger some things for people who watch it. But for me, that actually sometimes spoils the film because I don't actually read up about films before going in. So if there's some suicide in there or if there's some sensitive topics, I might not be aware of it until the warning comes up. But I think having that warning on there, having choice, is the logical way forward. But I think we're going to see, if not censorship itself, I think we're just going to see more and more calls for censorship over the years as more and more people get upset with the way how things are done in the past that don't reflect the current standards of society. The past is the past, and yeah, I just do not agree with tampering with it. But I think the more we go into the future, the more people will want to tamper with it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Sol, and I think you might be very much right there. I agree with Tom that I think that warnings are a very good solution, and given how much is just streamed now, that warning can even be optional, so people who want to go in without spoilers can just turn those warnings off or just avoid clicking on them. That might be a good solution. I like I said earlier, I don't mind films being cut or altered as long as the original version is still available. So if there's going to be child-friendly versions of certain films or just updated version of future of older films available, I don't mind that. I mean, if there's a film people thought were absolutely lovely for children, but it has some racist content, for instance, and it's very easy to get around that by editing the words, I don't have a huge issue with that as long as the original version is still available and people can choose which one they see. So yeah, I'll take a fairly pragmatic part of that. I just don't want people to be destroying existing films. I'd be very, very annoyed if people started destroying existing films or banning existing films or making it really, really hard to see hugely respected films in particular. That would be, like you said, like if veganism takes over completely and there starts being bans on even just showing consumption of meat, and John Dielman gets either cut down to 2 hours or something, with the taking scenes. I would be, and you can't see the original. I would be very frustrated. So let's hope it never gets to that point in terms of censorship. But yeah, you might be right, Salt. We might be on the cusp of, if not more censorship, a lot more calls for censorship, which is fine. I mean, I don't mind calls for censorship as much as I mind the actual censorship. Does anyone have any final notes or any words of encouragement or hope?
I just hope that in a few years' time, we don't have to come back and censor this episode.
What better finish than that? Let's hope. So, thank you so much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.